Get that man away from the aircraft. Now, Lieutenant Cameron Westbrook's voice cut through the crisp November morning like a blade, sharp enough to make nearby families flinch and turn toward the commotion. The Veterans Day open house at the Army Aviation Museum had barely begun, flags snapping in the wind along the entrance road, children clutching programs, veterans in ball caps emblazoned with unit insignias gathering near the vintage helicopter displays. But Westbrook saw none of that celebration. He saw only a problem, a threat to the perfect image he had spent 3 weeks cultivating for the visiting general's arrival. The problem was an old man standing near the Apache H-64D on static display, his weathered hand hovering inches from the aircraft's fuselage, trembling slightly but not quite making contact. He wore a torn Army field jacket that had been stitched together with safety pins and hope, boots wrapped in silver duct tape where the soles had separated from the leather, and he carried a rucksack on his back that, despite its worn condition, was packed with a precision that seemed out of place with the rest of his appearance. Ezekiel Okonkwo did not look up when the lieutenant shouted. He had heard voices like that before, voices that saw the surface and nothing beneath it, voices that had already decided what he was before he ever opened his mouth. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on the Apache, tracing the familiar lines of the airframe, noting the patch on the tailbone, where shrapnel had torn through the skin during a night extraction outside Kandahar, recognizing the replacement panel on the port side that he knew had been installed after the emergency landing that should have killed him, but somehow did not. 847 combat hours. That was what this aircraft represented. Not numbers on a maintenance log, but nights when the darkness became a weapon, when the rotors beat like a war drum above hostile territory, when young men with rifles trusted their lives to whoever sat in that cockpit. Ezekiel had been that whoever. For 23 years, he had been that man. Now he was just another vagrant making families uncomfortable at a public event. 2 security guards flanked Lieutenant Westbrook as he approached, their hands resting on their belts with the practiced caution of men who expected trouble. Westbrook himself was 28 years old, clean-shaven, his uniform pressed with geometric precision, his career trajectory a straight line pointing toward early promotion and command. He had been assigned as event coordinator because he understood optics, understood that generals notice details, understood that one homeless man near the aircraft displays could undo months of preparation. "Sir," Westbrook said, and the word carried no respect, only the thin veneer of protocol. "I need you to step away from the aircraft and relocate to the public viewing area." Ezekiel finally looked up. His face was weathered by decades of sun and wind and 6 years of sleeping under bridges. But his eyes were steady, dark brown and deep, carrying something that Westbrook did not recognize because he had never seen it. Those eyes had watched friends die. Those eyes had guided a crippled helicopter through 14 miles of hostile airspace on one engine. Those eyes had looked into the face of a dying co-pilot and made a promise that had haunted every day since. "I was just looking," Ezekiel said, his voice quiet, hoarse from disuse. "I am behind the rope." Westbrook's jaw tightened. "The general arrives in 2 hours. We cannot have people who look like you standing next to the displays." It sent the wrong message. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you are joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. And if stories like this one about courage, sacrifice, and hidden heroes speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten legends among us. You might even have a quiet hero in your own community whose humble appearance hides an extraordinary story of service. Now, let us continue. Ezekiel did not argue. He had stopped arguing years ago, stopped trying to explain himself to people who had already decided he was not worth hearing. He simply nodded once, adjusted the straps of his rucksack with movements that were economical and precise, and turned to walk toward the distant public area where the view of the Apache would be partially blocked by a maintenance vehicle. But as he walked, his gait steady despite the ruined boots, something about him made the younger of the 2 security guards hesitate. The man watched Ezekiel move and felt a flicker of recognition, not of the person, but of the pattern. He had served 4 years as an MP at Fort Campbell before taking this job. He had seen hundreds of soldiers walk, but only a certain kind walked like that. Only the ones who had been forged in the fire of special operations moved with that unconscious economy, that constant awareness of their surroundings, that readiness coiled beneath apparent calm. "Lieutenant," the guard said quietly, "you sure about this?" Westbrook did not bother to look at him. "I am sure that man is not spending the next 3 hours anywhere near our VIP section. Make certain he stays in the public area. If he causes any problems, call the MPs and have him removed from the installation entirely." The guard nodded but kept watching Ezekiel's retreating form, something nagging at him that he could not name. Ezekiel found a bench at the far edge of the public viewing area and lowered himself onto it, his joints protesting after the 7-mile walk from his spot beneath the overpass on Route 41. He had not planned to come today. For 6 years, he had avoided anything connected to his former life, avoided the bases and the memorials and the reunions where someone might recognize what remained of the man he used to be. But 3 weeks ago, he had seen the notice in a discarded newspaper, seen that tail number listed among the aircraft being added to the museum collection, and something inside him that he thought had died long ago refused to let him stay away. That was his bird, his and Terrence Blackwood's. 847 hours of brotherhood sealed in blood and fire, and the kind of trust that only exists between men who have held each other's lives in their hands. Bird had died in that aircraft, had bled out in the front seat while Ezekiel fought the controls and screamed his name and watched the light leave his eyes. And now it sat on static display with a plaque that probably did not mention any of that, probably reduced all of it to sterile numbers and antiseptic facts. Ezekiel's hand moved unconsciously to his chest, pressing against the 2 sets of dog tags hanging beneath his jacket, his own and Bird's. He had carried both for 19 years and would carry them until he died. From his bench, he could still see the Apache, smaller now with distance but unmistakable. He watched a crew chief polish the canopy and knew exactly how many scratches that glass should have, remembered the morning he had counted them while waiting for a mission brief that would send them into the mountains where everything went wrong. But what Lieutenant Westbrook did not know, what none of them knew, was that in exactly 3 hours the truth would surface in a way that no one could ignore. The old man in the torn jacket would stand at the center of a moment that would be talked about for years, and the young lieutenant who had dismissed him would struggle to find words, his certainty crumbling like sand as he finally understood what he had almost thrown away. Because some men who look broken are not broken at all. They are simply carrying weights that would crush anyone who has not learned to bear them. And Ezekiel Okonkwo had been bearing his for a very long time. The bench was cold beneath him, but Ezekiel barely noticed. His body had long ago stopped registering discomfort as anything worth acknowledging. 6 winters beneath overpasses and in abandoned buildings had recalibrated his understanding of what constituted hardship. And a metal bench on a November morning was nothing compared to the nights when frost crept into his sleeping bag and he woke with his fingers too stiff to grip the zipper. His hand moved beneath his jacket and found the dog tags, 2 sets on a single chain, the metal worn smooth from years of contact with the skin. He did not need to look at them to know what they said. His own tags listed the basics, name and service number and blood type, the bureaucratic reduction of a man to data points. But Bird's tags were different. Bird's tags carried 19 years of guilt and love and the kind of grief that never fades, only learns to coexist with breathing. The memory came without invitation, the way it always did when he let his guard down. April 2005, Hindu Kush Mountains. The mission brief had called it a routine extraction, for words that anyone who had spent time in special operations knew were a curse. Nothing was routine when you were flying into hostile territory at night, with nothing between you and the mountains but skill and luck and the prayers of men who had stopped believing in anything except each other. Ezekiel closed his eyes, and he was back in the cockpit, the familiar weight of the helmet pressing against his temples, the green glow of night vision painting the world in shades of phosphorescent shadow. Bird was in the front seat, working the sensors, his voice calm and steady over the internal calm as he called out terrain features and potential threats. They had flown together so many times that words were almost unnecessary. A slight adjustment of the cyclic, a shift into Bird's breathing, and they moved as a single organism through the darkness. The SEAL team was pinned down in a valley that the maps called the Devil's Throat, a narrow cut between ridgelines where the Taliban had been ambushing American patrols for months. The team leader's voice on the radio had carried the controlled urgency of a man who knew he was running out of time and ammunition. "Thunderhead, we need you now. They are closing from the north and east. Danger close." Ezekiel had pushed the Apache harder than the manual said was possible, diving into that valley like a hawk stooping on prey, Tabor's gun opening up on the muzzle flashes that sparkled along the ridgeline. For 11 minutes, they held the Taliban back. 11 minutes of controlled violence that gave the SEALs time to consolidate and prepare for extraction. The Chinook was 2 minutes out when the RPG came. He never saw the shooter. That was what haunted him most. 23 years of training, thousands of hours scanning for threats, and he never saw the man who killed his best friend. The rocket came from a window in a compound they had cleared twice with cannon fire, launched by someone who had waited with patience that bordered on inhuman until the Apache banked into the perfect angle. The impact threw the aircraft sideways. Warning lights bloomed across the instrument panel like malevolent flowers. And Bird's voice, always so steady, suddenly changed into something wet and wrong. Zeke. His name, not his call sign. Bird only used his real name when things were serious. "Zeke, I'm hit bad." Ezekiel had fought the controls with everything he had, the aircraft shuddering around him, hydraulics failing, one engine screaming toward destruction. He could not turn around to see Bird, could not take his hands off the controls for even a second, or they would spiral in the mountains and become another classified casualty in a war that most Americans had already forgotten. Bird's voice grew weaker with each transmission. The shrapnel had torn through his seat, through his body armor, through the flesh and bone beneath. He was bleeding out in the front seat, and there was nothing Ezekiel could do except fly. "Get home to your girls, Thunderhead." Bird's last words, spoken with the clarity that sometimes comes at the end, when the body knows it is dying and decides to give one final gift of lucidity. "Promise me. Get home to your girls." Ezekiel had promised. He had screamed the words into the calm as he nursed the crippled Apache across 14 miles of hostile territory, as Bird's breathing slowed and stopped and the silence in the cockpit became absolute. He had promised, and the SEALs had lived, all of them, extracted by the Chinook that arrived just as Ezekiel auto-rotated into the forward operating base on fumes and prayers. They gave him a silver star for that night, a distinguished flying cross, a Purple Heart for the shrapnel that had peppered his own arm and shoulder, wounds he had not even noticed until the medics pointed out the blood soaking through his flight suit. They called him a hero, and he had wanted to scream at them that heroes did not let their brothers die, that heroes saw the shooter before the rocket launched, that heroes kept their promises. He opened his eyes, and he was back on the bench, back in the present, his face wet with tears he did not remember shedding. The Apache sat in the distance, silent and still, no longer a weapon but a monument. Somewhere inside that airframe were stains that no amount of cleaning could fully remove. Molecules of Bird's blood worked into the metal and composite, a permanent marker of the price that had been paid. Ezekiel reached into his rucksack and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. Bird's aviator sunglasses, one lens cracked, the frame bent from the impact. He had pulled them from Bird's face before the recovery team arrived, had carried them for 19 years through every deployment and every duty station, and finally through every night on the streets. He could not explain why he kept them. He only knew that throwing them away would be a betrayal worse than any he had already committed. The second memory came then, layered over the first like a photograph superimposed on another. Lorraine in the hospital bed, her body ravaged by the cancer that had come without warning and taken everything within 11 months. The twins sitting on either side of her, holding her hands, their faces mirrors of each other and mirrors of their mother. and Lorraine looking at him with eyes that still held love despite everything, asking him to be strong for the girls, to be there for them when she could not. He had tried. For 2 years after her death, he had tried to be the father they needed, tried to look at them without seeing her face, tried to sleep in the bed they had shared without reaching for a body that was no longer there. But the grief had combined with the guilt he already carried, Tabor's death and Lorraine's death merging into a weight that crushed the air from his lungs every time he walked into his own home. The note he left was simple. I love you both. I am sorry. Live your lives. Do not look for me. He had written it at 3 in the morning, placed it on the kitchen table, and walked out the door with nothing but his rucksack and the things he could not leave behind. Tabor's sunglasses, Lorraine's wedding ring on a chain around his neck, a photograph of the twins at their college graduation, smiling in their caps and gowns, unaware that their father was watching from across the street, close enough to see their faces but too broken to approach. 6 years. 6 years of hiding and running and watching for shadows. 6 years of convincing himself that they were better off without him, that his presence would only remind them of everything they had lost. 6 years of keeping his promise to Tabor in the only way he knew how, staying alive even when he did not want to, breathing even when each breath felt like a betrayal of everyone he had failed. And now he sat on a cold bench watching the aircraft where it all began, wondering why he had come, knowing the answer even as he asked the question. Because some things cannot be outrun. Because some debts cannot be paid. Because somewhere inside the man who had given up on everything was a pilot who still remembered what it meant to fly, and that pilot had needed to see his bird one last time before the end. Lieutenant Westbrook stood at the edge of the ceremony stage, clipboard in hand, checking items off a list that had consumed his every waking moment for 3 weeks. The risers were aligned to the millimeter. The flags hung at precisely regulation height. The chairs in the VIP section had been wiped down twice and arranged with spacing that would satisfy the most demanding protocol officer. Everything was perfect, and in 2 hours General Harrison would arrive to see exactly the kind of event that earned young officers early promotions and favorable efficiency reports. But his eyes kept drifting toward the public viewing area, toward the bench where the old vagrant sat staring at the Apache display with an intensity that made Westbrook uncomfortable in ways he could not articulate. The man had not moved in nearly an hour, had not approached anyone or caused any disturbance, had simply sat there, motionless except for the occasional movement of his hand toward his chest, watching the helicopter like it owed him something. Westbrook told himself the discomfort was professional concern. The general would be touring the displays before the ceremony. If the homeless man decided to approach to ask for money or make a scene, it could derail everything. Better to remove the variable entirely than risk the consequences. That was sound leadership. That was thinking ahead. He handed his clipboard to a nearby sergeant and walked toward the public area, his stride purposeful, his expression fixed in the neutral mask he had perfected during 4 years at West Point. The 2 security guards from earlier fell into step behind him without being asked, reading his intent in the set of his shoulders. Ezekiel saw them coming. He had been watching approaches and calculating threat levels since before this lieutenant was born, and 3 men walking with coordinated purpose toward his position registered on instincts that 6 years of civilian life had not dulled. He did not stand, did not tense. Simply waited with the patience of a man who had learned that most confrontations resolve themselves if you refuse to escalate. Westbrook stopped 3 feet from the bench, close enough to establish dominance, far enough to maintain the appearance of propriety. I thought I made myself clear earlier. You need to relocate. Ezekiel looked up at him, his expression neutral. I am in the public area, behind all the ropes. I have not spoken to anyone or approached any displays. That is not the point. Westbrook's voice carried an edge now, frustration bleeding through the professional veneer. The point is that your presence here is inappropriate. This is a military event celebrating military service. It is not a homeless shelter. Something flickered in Ezekiel's eyes, there and gone so quickly that Westbrook almost missed it. A flash of something that might have been anger, or might have been grief, or might have been the weight of words that begged to be spoken, but had been swallowed so many times they had become stones in his throat. I served, Ezekiel said quietly. 23 years. Westbrook's laugh was short and sharp, a sound designed to wound. Right? And what unit was that? Let me guess. Special Forces. Delta. Maybe you were a Navy SEAL too. 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Ezekiel's voice did not change, did not rise to meet the mockery. Warrant Officer. Night Stalkers. The name landed differently than Westbrook expected. The Night Stalkers were legends in Army aviation, the elite of the elite, pilots who flew missions that officially never happened in places that officially did not exist. Every aviator knew the stories, the impossible extractions and the classified operations, and the men who came home in flag-draped coffins without anyone ever knowing where they had really died. For a moment, just a moment, something like doubt crossed Westbrook's face. Then he shook his head, the doubt replaced by renewed certainty. Night Stalkers. Sure, and I suppose you have documentation to prove that. A DD-214 maybe. Some kind of identification. Ezekiel said nothing. His discharge papers were in a storage unit in Tennessee that he had not visited in 6 years, paid for automatically from an account he had never closed, containing the physical evidence of a life he had walked away from. He carried no identification because identification meant being found, and being found meant facing the daughters he had abandoned and the promise he had broken. That is what I thought. Westbrook turned to the security guards. If he is still here in 10 minutes, escort him off the installation. I do not care what story he tells you. The guards exchanged glances. The younger one, the former MP who had noticed something earlier, spoke up. Lieutenant, maybe we should verify his claims before we remove him. If he really did serve with the 160th, this could become a situation. Westbrook rounded on him. Look at him, Sergeant. Does that look like a special operations pilot to you? Does that look like someone who flew classified missions and received commendations? He looks like exactly what he is. A vagrant who wandered onto an Army installation looking for a handout and invented a story to avoid being removed. Other visitors had begun to notice the confrontation. A family with 2 young children moved away, the father pulling his sons closer as if homelessness were contagious. An older couple watched with expressions that might have been sympathy or might have been relief that someone was dealing with the problem. Several active duty soldiers in dress uniforms observed from near the static displays, their faces unreadable. And near the main hangar, standing apart from the gathering crowd, an elderly man in civilian clothes watched the scene unfold with growing attention. He wore a museum board member badge on his lapel and carried himself with the unconscious authority of someone who had spent decades giving orders. His name was Colonel Vincent Harrelson, retired, and he had commanded the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment during some of its most intense years of combat operations. He had pinned medals on the chests of pilots who had done the impossible and written letters to the families of those who had not come home. Something about the old man on the bench tugged at his memory. Something about the way he sat, the way he held himself even under verbal assault, the way his hand kept moving toward his chest where dog tags would hang if he were telling the truth about his service. Harrelson had seen that posture before, had seen that stillness, had seen that particular quality of patience that came from years of waiting in cockpits for missions to begin, years of controlling fear through discipline, years of trusting that the moment for action would come if you simply held your ground. He began walking toward the confrontation, his pace measured, his mind turning through decades of faces and names and call signs, searching for a match that hovered just beyond the edge of recognition. Westbrook was still talking, his voice rising with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. I'm going to give you one more chance to leave voluntarily. After that, the MPs will be involved, and whatever story you have concocted will be tested against actual records. If you have been impersonating a service member, that is a federal offense. If you have been wearing insignia or claiming awards you did not earn, that is stolen valor. Either way, your best option is to walk away right now and never come back. Ezekiel looked past the lieutenant, past the security guards, past the watching crowd. His eyes found the Apache in the distance, silent on its display stand, And for a moment he was back in that cockpit, to Bird's voice in his ears, the mountains rushing up to meet them, the weight of lives depending on every movement of his hands. He had walked away from everything else. His career, his family, his identity. He had let them take all of it because he believed he did not deserve to keep any of it. But he could not walk away from this. Not from the aircraft that held his brother's blood. Not from the only thing left that proved any of it had been real. No, Ezekiel said, and his voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made Westbrook take an involuntary step backward. I'm not leaving. The word hung in the air between them, small and quiet and utterly immovable. No, Westbrook had not expected resistance. He had expected the shuffling compliance of a man who knew his place, the mumbled apologies and downcast eyes of someone accustomed to being moved along. Instead, he faced something that his 4 years at West Point and 3 years of commissioned service had not prepared him to recognize. He faced a man who had simply stopped retreating. You are refusing a direct order to vacate the premises. Westbrook's voice climbed half an octave, the words coming faster now. That is trespassing. That is obstruction. I will have you arrested. Ezekiel did not respond. His attention had shifted to something beyond the lieutenant, beyond the security guards, beyond the small crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation. Colonel Harrelson was approaching, and though Ezekiel did not recognize the face beneath the silver hair and the years, something about the way the man moved triggered a response buried deep in his nervous system. That was command presence. That was the walk of someone who had led men into places where walking wrong meant dying. Harrelson stopped beside Westbrook, his eyes fixed on Ezekiel with an intensity that made the lieutenant fall silent mid-sentence. The colonel did not speak immediately. He studied the old man on the bench the way a pilot studies terrain before a mission, cataloging details, searching for landmarks that might confirm his position. The torn jacket with its safety pin repairs, the boots wrapped in duct tape, the rucksack packed with a precision that spoke of thousands of equipment inspections. The way the man's hand rested near his chest, fingers curved as if holding something precious beneath the fabric. The stillness that was not passivity but readiness. The coiled potential of someone who had learned to wait for the right moment, because in his world, acting too soon was as fatal as acting too late. And beneath all of that, beneath the grime and the years and the obvious hardship, something familiar. Something that tugged at memories Harrelson had not accessed in years. "What is your name, soldier?" Harrelson's voice was quiet, but it carried the unmistakable weight of a man accustomed to being answered. Ezekiel looked at him for a long moment. The colonel's face meant nothing to him, lost in the blur of officers and briefings and ceremonies that had filled his years of service. But the voice, the tone, the way the question was framed not as a challenge, but as an invitation, that meant something. "Okonkwo," he said finally. Ezekiel Okonkwo. The name hit Harrelson like a physical blow. His face went pale, the blood draining from his cheeks so quickly that Westbrook instinctively reached out as if expecting the older man to collapse. But Harrelson did not collapse. He stood rooted to the ground, his eyes locked on Ezekiel, his mind racing through dates and operations and the faces of men he had sent into darkness hoping they would return. "Call sign," Harrelson said, and his voice had changed, had become something rough and urgent and barely controlled. Ezekiel's hand moved to his chest, pressing against the dog tags beneath his jacket. He had not spoken the word aloud in 6 years, had not claimed that identity since the night he walked away from his daughters and everything else that made him who he was. But the colonel was waiting, and somewhere beneath the layers of grief and guilt, the pilot who had earned that name was waiting too. "Thunderhead," Ezekiel said. The sound that escaped Harrelson was half laugh and half sob, a noise that seemed to tear itself from somewhere deep in his chest. His hand shot out and gripped Ezekiel's shoulder, not with aggression, but with the desperate need to confirm that what he was seeing was real. "My God," Harrelson breathed. "Thunderhead, we thought you were dead." Westbrook stood frozen, his clipboard hanging forgotten at his side, his carefully constructed understanding of the situation crumbling like sand beneath a wave. He looked from the colonel to the homeless man and back again, searching for an explanation that made sense, finding nothing but the raw emotion on Harrelson's face. "Sir," Westbrook managed, "I do not understand. Who is this man?" Harrelson did not take his eyes off Ezekiel. This man is Chief Warrant Officer 5 Ezekiel Okonkwo, call sign Thunderhead. He flew with the 160th for 23 years. He has 3 distinguished flying crosses, a silver star, 2 bronze stars, and a Purple Heart. He flew missions that you will never read about in any history book because they are still classified. He is one of the finest pilots the Night Stalkers ever produced, and you have been standing here, threatening to have him arrested for trespassing. The words fell into silence. Around them, the crowd had grown larger, drawn by the visible emotion of the confrontation. Active duty soldiers moved closer, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something else as the colonel's words registered. A veteran in a ball cap with 160th SOAR embroidered on the front pushed through the gathering, his weathered face showing the shock of recognition. "Thunderhead," the veteran repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "I flew with you in '03. Operation Anaconda. You pulled my crew out of a hot LZ when everyone else said it was suicide." Ezekiel looked at the man and found nothing in his memory. There had been so many operations, so many extractions, so many faces glimpsed briefly in the chaos of combat, and then lost to the blur of the next mission. He had stopped counting the lives he saved because counting felt like a betrayal of the ones he had lost. Harrelson's grip on his shoulder tightened. "Where have you been, Zeke? After Lorraine passed, you just vanished. Your daughters have been searching for years." At the mention of his daughters, something in Ezekiel's face changed. The careful neutrality cracked, and beneath it was a pain so raw that Harrelson had to look away for a moment to compose himself. "I cannot stay," Ezekiel said, and his voice was barely audible. "I looked at them and saw her. I looked at them and saw every promise I had broken. I thought they would be better without me dragging them down." Harrelson shook his head slowly. "They never stopped looking. Every base they get stationed at, they check the shelters, the VA hospitals, the streets. Aaliyah and Amara have spent 6 years trying to find their father." Ezekiel's eyes closed. The names hit him harder than any accusation Westbrook had thrown, harder than any physical blow he had ever absorbed. His girls, his twins, still searching after all this time, still refusing to accept that he was gone, still holding on a hope that he had tried so hard to kill. "They are here," Harrelson said quietly. "Today, right now, they are receiving an award at the ceremony. The Army Aviation Association Humanitarian Service Award. They flew disaster relief missions that saved hundreds of lives. They became pilots, Zeke. Both of them. Because of you." Ezekiel's eyes opened, and in them was something that had not been there before. Something that looked almost like terror, but might have been hope, and might have been the first stirring of a heart that had convinced itself it had stopped beating years ago. Ezekiel rose from the bench so quickly that Harrelson stepped back, his hand falling from the old man's shoulder. The motion was fluid despite the years, despite the malnutrition and the cold nights and the damage that living on the streets inflicts on a body. For a moment, the pilot was visible beneath the vagrant, the warrior beneath the wanderer, and everyone watching saw it. "I have to go," Ezekiel said. His eyes were wild now, darting toward the ceremony stage in the distance where chairs were being arranged and a podium was being tested. "I cannot be here when they arrive. I cannot let them see me like this." Harrelson moved to block his path, not aggressively, but with the firm positioning of a man who had spent decades preventing good soldiers from making bad decisions. "Zeke, listen to me. They have been searching for 6 years. 6 years of hoping and praying and refusing to give up. If you run now, if you disappear again, it will destroy them." Ezekiel shook his head, the motion sharp and desperate. "Look at me, Colonel. Look at what I have become. They remember a father who flew helicopters and taught them about the stars and told them they could be anything they wanted. They do not need to see this. They do not need to know that their father has been sleeping under bridges and eating from dumpsters while they were becoming heroes. What they need is their father. Harrelson's voice was gentle but unyielding. Not the uniform, not the medals, not the legend. Just their father, alive, breathing, present. That is all they have ever wanted. The crowd around them had grown larger still. Word was spreading through the gathering in whispers and urgent phone calls. Thunderhead is here. The Thunderhead. The pilot who had become a legend in special operations aviation, whose missions were taught at flight school as examples of what was possible when skill and courage combined. Soldiers who had only heard the stories stood alongside veterans who had lived them, all of them watching the impossible scene unfold. Lieutenant Westbrook had not moved. He stood where Harrelson had left him, his face the color of ash, his career calculus rapidly recalculating. He had threatened to arrest a Silver Star recipient. He had mocked a man with 3 distinguished flying crosses. He had dismissed one of the most decorated pilots in Night Stalker history as a vagrant looking for handouts. The implications of what he had done were still cascading through his mind when his phone buzzed with a message from his commanding officer, asking why there was a commotion near the static displays. Ezekiel tried to step around Harrelson, but the younger security guard moved to intercept him, not to stop him forcefully, but to add his presence to the barrier. The guard's face held something that might have been shame for his earlier compliance with Westbrook's orders. "Sir," the guard said, and this time the word carried genuine respect. "Please, just wait. I cannot wait." Ezekiel's voice cracked on the words. "You do not understand. I left them. I walked out in the middle of the night and left a note telling them not to look for me. I abandoned my daughters when they needed me most because I was too broken to be what they deserved. How do I face them after that? How do I explain 6 years of silence? You tell them the truth." Harrelson stepped closer, his voice dropping so that only Ezekiel could hear. "You tell them that the same strength that kept you flying through enemy fire could not protect you from the grief of losing your wife. You tell them that you love them so much you convince yourself they were better off without you. You tell them you were wrong, and then you let them decide what happens next." Ezekiel's hands were trembling. His whole body was trembling, 6 years of carefully constructed numbness cracking under the weight of what Harrelson was asking. He had survived by not feeling, by reducing his existence to the simple mechanics of breathing and eating and finding shelter. Feeling meant remembering. Remembering meant drowning in the faces of everyone he had failed. But Harrelson was not finished. "Do you know what your daughters do, Zeke? Do you know what kind of pilots they have become? They fly into disasters. Hurricanes, earthquakes, floods. They fly when other pilots say the conditions are too dangerous, when the risk is too high, when the smart thing would be to wait for better weather. They do it because they learn from you that some things are worth the risk, that some people are worth dying to save." Ezekiel closed his eyes. The words were a blade, cutting through defenses he had spent years building. They needed someone to teach them that. Harrelson continued, "And you were not there. Lorraine told them stories about you instead, about the missions you flew, about the lives you saved, about the father who would move mountains to protect his family. She kept you alive for them even after you left. She made sure they knew who you really were." The mention of Lorraine's name opened something in Ezekiel that he had kept sealed since the night he walked away. His wife, dying of cancer, had spent her remaining strength making sure their daughters remembered their father as a hero instead of a deserter. She had known he would run. She had known him better than he knew himself. And she had prepared their girls for the absence she saw coming. "She knew," Ezekiel whispered. "She knew I would leave." Harrelson nodded slowly. "She called me 2 weeks before she passed. Asked me to look out for you if I could. Said you were going to blame yourself for her death the same way you blamed yourself for Tabird. Said the guilt would eat you alive if someone did not intervene. But you did not find me. I tried." Harrelson's voice carried old frustration and older grief. "You disappeared completely. No credit cards, no phone, no contact with anyone from your old life. It was like you had died alongside her." Ezekiel opened his eyes and looked toward the ceremony area. The stage was nearly ready now. Technicians tested microphones and adjusted lighting. VIP guests were beginning to arrive, officers in dress uniforms and civilians in formal attire. Somewhere in that gathering, his daughters were preparing to receive an award for the kind of flying he had taught them to value. Dangerous flying. Necessary flying. The kind that saved lives at the risk of your own. And he was standing here in a torn jacket held together with safety pins, his boots wrapped in duct tape, his body weakened by years of neglect, about to shatter the image of their father that Lorraine had worked so hard to preserve. "I cannot," Ezekiel said again, but the words had lost their certainty. Harrelson saw the crack and pressed into it. "You can, and you will, because Tabird told you to get home to your girls, and you have been breaking that promise for 19 years. It is time to stop breaking it, Zeke. It is time to go home." The crowd parted as a new figure approached, drawn by the commotion and the whispered name that had spread through the gathering like wildfire. He was young, late 20s, wearing the flight suit of an active-duty Apache pilot with the insignia of the 1st Attack Reconnaissance Battalion on his shoulder. His name tag read Chun, and his face carried the expression of someone who had just heard something impossible and needed to confirm it with his own eyes. "Excuse me," Chun said, pushing through the ring of onlookers until he stood face to face with Ezekiel. His voice trembled slightly. "Did I hear right? Are you Thunderhead? Chief Warrant Officer 5 Okonkwo?" Ezekiel looked at the young pilot and saw himself 40 years ago. The same eager intensity. The same hunger to prove worthy of the aircraft he flew. The same ignorance of what war would eventually cost him. "I was," Ezekiel said quietly. "A long time ago." Chin shook his head as if rejecting the qualification. "Sir, we study your missions at flight school. The Hindu Kush extraction is required reading. The way you compensated for the hydraulic failure while managing the combat situation. The 14 miles you flew on one engine with your gunner gone." He paused, his voice catching. "They told us you were dead, that you passed away years ago, that the only reason your missions were declassified was because you were not around to object." Harrelson stepped forward. "Who told you that, son?" "The instructors, sir." Chin's confusion was evident. "They said Thunderhead died sometime after leaving the service, that his records were sealed out of respect for his family." Harrelson exchanged a glance with Ezekiel. Someone had made assumptions when Ezekiel vanished. Someone had decided that a man who disappeared so completely must have died, and that assumption had become accepted fact within the aviation community. The legend of Thunderhead had been preserved by turning him into a ghost story, a cautionary tale of sacrifice that ended in presumed death rather than the Messier truth of survival and breakdown. "I am not dead," Ezekiel said, and something in his voice suggested he was only recently certain of that himself. More pilots were gathering now, young warrants and seasoned veterans alike, drawn by the impossible news. The man they had studied, the pilot whose techniques they had practiced in simulators, the legend whose call sign was spoken with reverence in ready rooms across the Army, was standing in front of them in a torn jacket and duct-tape boots. A woman in her 50s pushed through the crowd, her museum staff badge identifying her as the curator of the aviation collection. She carried a tablet, and her face was flushed with barely contained excitement. "Colonel Harrelson," she said breathlessly. "I pulled up the display information for Apache 890192. The plaque lists Chief Warrant Officer 5 Ezekiel Okonkwo as the primary pilot with 847 combat flight hours." She looked at Ezekiel with something approaching awe. "We have been displaying your aircraft for 3 months, sir. We had no idea you were still alive." Ezekiel's gaze drifted past her toward the Apache in the distance. His aircraft, his and Tabird's, the machine that had carried them through hell and brought only one of them home. "The placard," he said slowly. "Does it mention my co-pilot, Warrant Officer Terrence Blackwood? Call signed to Bird." The curator checked her tablet, scrolling through information. "It mentions that the aircraft saw combat in multiple theaters and that a crew member was killed in action during a 2005 operation. But it does not include names of other crew members." She hesitated. "Should it?" Ezekiel nodded once, a small motion that carried the weight of 19 years. "He was the best gunner I ever flew with. He died saving a SEAL team that would have been overrun without our support. His name should be on that plaque." The curator made a note on her tablet, her fingers moving quickly. I will make sure it happens, sir. I promise. Around them, the gathering continued to grow. Soldiers called friends. Veterans called other veterans. The story spread through text messages and phone calls, each retelling adding to the sense of impossible reunion. Someone had started recording with a phone, capturing the moment for reasons they could not fully articulate. Lieutenant Westbrook still had not moved from where Harrelson had left him. His face had progressed from ash white to something closer to green, the color of a man watching his career prospect crumble in real time. He had threatened to arrest a legend. He had mocked a hero. The recordings being made around him would ensure that his mistake followed him for the rest of his military service. But Ezekiel was not focused on Westbrook. His attention had been captured by movement near the ceremony stage, by two figures in army dress uniforms walking toward the VIP seating area. They were too far away for him to see their faces clearly, but he did not need to see their faces. He would recognize the way they moved anywhere. The confidence stride, the slight tilt of the head when one spoke to the other. The unconscious synchronization of twins who had spent their entire lives in perfect orbit around each other. Aaliyah and Amara, his girls, his daughters who had somehow become Army aviators despite his absence, who had learned to fly from instructors using techniques their father had pioneered, who had spent 6 years searching for a man who had convinced himself he did not deserve to be found. They were beautiful, even at this distance, even through eyes blurred by tears he refused to acknowledge. He could see that they had grown into remarkable women. They carried themselves like officers and pilots and warriors, like exactly the people Lorraine had dreamed they would become. Ezekiel's hand moved to his chest, pressing against the dog tags beneath his jacket. To Bird's tags and his own, the metal warm from his body heat, the edges worn smooth from 2 decades of constant contact. He had carried his brother's last request for 19 years. Get home to your girls. Promise me. He had broken that promise every day since he walked out his house in the middle of the night. Had broken it every time he chose to watch from shadows instead of stepping into the light. Had broken it every time he told himself that his daughters were better off believing he was dead than knowing he had simply given up. But they had not believed he was dead. They had kept searching. They had refused to accept the lie he had tried to make true. They are right there, Harrelson said softly, appearing at Ezekiel's shoulder. 50 yards away. All you have to do is walk. Ezekiel's feet would not move. The distance between him and his daughters might as well have been an ocean, a chasm filled with 6 years of silence and abandonment, and the kind of failure that no amount of medals could redeem. I do not know how, he whispered. I do not know how to be their father again. You start by showing up, Harrelson replied. Everything else comes after. The public address system crackled to life, cutting through the murmur of the growing crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, the Veterans Day ceremony will begin in approximately 45 minutes. Please begin making your way to the seating area. VIP guests should check in at the registration table near the main stage. 45 minutes. The number landed in Ezekiel's chest like a stone. In 45 minutes, his daughters would be sitting in the front row, waiting to receive an award for the kind of flying that had defined his own career. In 45 minutes, a general would stand at that podium and speak about courage and sacrifice and the traditions of Army aviation. And Ezekiel would be standing here, paralyzed by fear, watching from the edges like he had watched everything else in their lives for the past 6 years. Harrelson had not moved from his side. The colonel seemed to understand that pushing too hard would break something fragile, that Ezekiel needed to find his own way across the distance that separated him from his daughters. But understanding did not mean acceptance, and the frustration was beginning to show in the set of Harrelson's jaw. The young pilot Chun approached again, his expression shifting between awe and uncertainty. Sir, if I may. He hesitated, searching for words. When we study your missions, the instructors always emphasize one thing. They say Thunderhead never hesitated, that when the moment came, when lives were on the line, you moved without second-guessing yourself. They say that is what separated you from pilots who were technically skilled but could not perform under pressure. Ezekiel looked at the young man, seeing again the reflection of his younger self. That was combat. This is different. Is it though? Chen's voice was quiet but steady. Your daughters are over there. They have been searching for you for 6 years. Is not that a kind of combat? Are not their hearts on the line right now, even if they do not know it yet? The words hit harder than Chen probably intended. Ezekiel had spent 2 decades flying into situations where hesitation meant death, where the only path forward was through the fire regardless of the odds. He had extracted teams from impossible positions, had landed in hot zones that would have made lesser pilots turn back, had pushed himself and his aircraft beyond every limit because the people counting on him had no other option. But this was not a hot zone. This was his daughters, and the enemy was not Taliban fighters or mechanical failure. The enemy was himself. The enemy was the voice in his head that had spent 6 years telling him he was not worthy of their love, not worthy of their forgiveness, not worthy of anything except the slow dissolution he had chosen when he walked away. A commotion near the ceremony stage drew everyone's attention. A group of officers had gathered around someone, their body language suggesting urgent conversation. Ezekiel watched as one of them pointed toward the crowd near the Apache display, toward the cluster of people that had formed around him. Phones were being consulted. Calls were being made. The information was spreading beyond the immediate gathering, climbing the chain of command with the speed of genuine news. Colonel Harrelson, someone called from the edge of the crowd. A major in dress uniform was pushing through, his face flushed with exertion and something else. Confusion, perhaps, or disbelief. Sir, I just received a call from General Harrison's aide. They are asking about a disturbance near the static displays. Something about a homeless veteran claiming to be Thunderhead. He is not claiming anything, Harrelson replied, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had spent decades being obeyed. He is Thunderhead, Chief Warrant Officer 5 Ezekiel Okonkwo. I served with him for 15 years. I pinned his distinguished flying cross myself after the Anaconda operation. The Major's face went through a rapid series of expressions as he processed this information. Sir, the General is going to want to know. The ceremony starts in less than an hour. If this is really Thunderhead, if the stories are true, this changes everything. Then go tell him. Harrelson's patience was thinning, and while you are at it, tell him that Lieutenant Westbrook spent the last hour trying to have Chief Okonkwo arrested for trespassing and stolen valor. I'm sure the General will find that detail interesting. The Major glanced at Westbrook, who had finally begun to move, backing slowly away from the crowd, as if hoping to escape before his name became permanently attached to the disaster he had created. But escape was impossible now. Too many people had witnessed the confrontation. Too many phones had recorded his words. His command performance was about to become a cautionary tale told to young officers about the dangers of assumption and arrogance. Ezekiel watched all of this with a detachment that surprised him. The politics, the career implications, the spreading ripples of consequence, none of it mattered. What mattered was the ceremony stage in the distance, and the 2 women who would soon be sitting there, unaware that their father was close enough to reach if only he could make his feet move. He thought about Tabard, about the last mission, the last conversation, the last breath his brother had taken in the seat in front of him. Tabard had been the bravest man Ezekiel ever knew, fearless in combat, unflinching under fire. But Tabard's final act had not been an act of combat bravery. It had been an act of love. His last words had not been about the mission or the enemy or the aircraft that was failing around them. His last words had been about Ezekiel's family, about the girls waiting at home who needed their father to survive. Get home to your girls, Thunderhead. Promise me. Ezekiel had promised. And then he had spent 19 years finding ways to break that promise while technically staying alive. He had told himself that survival was enough, that breathing and existing fulfilled the letter of his vow. But Tabard had not meant mere survival. Tabard had meant living. Tabard had meant being present. Tabard had meant being the father that his girls deserved. I am tired, Ezekiel said suddenly, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears. Stronger than it had been in years, but also more broken. I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of watching for shadows. I'm tired of breaking promises to dead men. Harrelson put a hand on his shoulder. Then stop. The crowd had gone quiet around them, sensing that something was shifting, that the frozen moment was beginning to thaw. Chun stood with his fellow pilots, their faces reflecting the tension of the scene. The curator clutched her tablet to her chest. The security guards watched with expressions that mixed professional concern with personal investment. Ezekiel took a breath, then another, and then, for the first time in 6 years, he took a step toward his daughters. The first step was the hardest. Ezekiel's body had spent 6 years learning to move away from connection, away from recognition, away from anything that might anchor him to the life he had abandoned. Reversing that momentum felt like fighting gravity itself, like trying to climb out a hole he had spent years digging with his own hands. But he took the step, and then another, and then the crowd began to part around him, soldiers and veterans and civilians stepping aside to create a path toward the ceremony area. No one spoke. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of the public address system announcing parking instructions and the snap of flags in the November wind. Harrelson walked beside him, not guiding but accompanying, his presence a steady anchor against the tide of doubt that threatened to pull Ezekiel back toward the shadows. The colonel had aged since their years of service together, silver replacing the dark hair that Ezekiel remembered, lines deepening around eyes that had seen too much. But his bearing was unchanged, the same quiet authority that had made him one of the most respected commanders in special operations aviation. They were halfway to the ceremony stage when the commotion began. A cluster of officers near the VIP registration table had spotted their approach, and whatever information had reached them through the chain of command was now visible in their faces. Shock, disbelief. The particular expression of people confronting something they had been told was impossible. A bird colonel broke away from the group and strode toward them, his gait quick but controlled. His uniform bore the insignia of the aviation branch and enough ribbons to suggest a career of significant achievement. He stopped directly in Ezekiel's path, his eyes scanning the torn jacket and the duct-tape boots before rising to meet Ezekiel's gaze. "I am Colonel Mitchell," he said. "Installation commandée. I have been receiving some extraordinary reports about a disturbance near the static displays." "No disturbance, Kenneth." Harrelson stepped forward slightly, positioning himself as a buffer. "Just a reunion that took everyone by surprise. This is Chief Warrant Officer 5 Ezekiel Okonkwo. Call sign Thunderhead. I served with him for 15 years in the 160th. Mitchell's face underwent a transformation that Ezekiel had seen before, the rapid recalculation of a military mind confronted with unexpected intelligence. The colonel's eyes dropped again to Ezekiel's appearance, then rose to study his face with new intensity. "Thunderhead," Mitchell repeated slowly. "The Hindu Kush extraction. Operation Gothic Serpent. The classified insertions during the initial push into Afghanistan." Among others, Harrelson confirmed. Mitchell was quiet for a moment, processing. Then he straightened, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, hardened into something formal and precise. "Chief Okonkwo, I have been informed that one of my officers treated you with disrespect this morning, that he threatened you with arrest and accused you of stolen valor. I want you to know that his conduct does not represent this installation or the United States Army." Ezekiel shook his head slightly. The lieutenant was doing his job. He saw what he saw. What he saw was a decorated combat veteran. Mitchell replied firmly. What he should have seen was a man worthy of respect regardless of his current circumstances. He paused, his expression shifting. "I am also told that your daughters are here today, that they are receiving the Army Aviation Association Humanitarian Service Award." The mention of his daughters sent a tremor through Ezekiel's composure. "Yes, sir. They are remarkable officers." Mitchell's voice softened slightly. "I have read their files. The disaster relief missions they have flown would have made any parent proud." He hesitated, then added quietly, "They have been searching for you for a long time, Chief. Everyone in Army aviation knows the story. The daughters of Thunderhead, looking for their father." Ezekiel could not speak. The words lodged in his throat like stones, too heavy to move, too painful to swallow. "The ceremony begins in 30 minutes, Mitchell continued. I would be honored if you would allow us to provide you with a proper uniform. You deserve to be present for your daughter's recognition, and you deserve to be seen as what you are. A hero. The word struck Ezekiel like a physical blow. He had not thought of himself as a hero in decades. Heroes did not abandon their families. Heroes did not break promises to dying friends. Heroes did not spend years hiding from the people who loved them, because facing that love required a courage they could not summon. I'm not a hero, Ezekiel said, his voice rough. I'm a father who failed his daughters. I am a pilot who could not save his co-pilot. I am a man who ran away when things got hard. Mitchell exchanged a glance with Harrelson, some silent communication passing between them. Then the installation commander did something unexpected. He reached out and gripped Ezekiel's shoulder, not with the formal distance of rank, but with the simple human contact of one soldier to another. Chief Okonkwo, he said quietly, I have commanded thousands of soldiers in my career. I have seen men break under pressure that would crush anyone. I have written letters to families explaining that their loved ones died with honor, even when the truth was more complicated. He paused, his grip tightening. What I have learned is that heroism is not about being unbroken. It is about getting back up. It is about taking the next step, even when everything in you wants to stop. What you are doing right now, walking toward your daughters after 6 years, that takes more courage than any combat mission I have ever seen. Ezekiel stared at the colonel, searching for the lie, the platitude, the empty comfort that people offered when they did not understand. But Mitchell's eyes held only sincerity, the hard-won wisdom of a man who had seen enough of war to know that the battles after the fighting were often the hardest. 30 minutes, Mitchell said, releasing his shoulder. Let's get you ready. The entourage that had gathered around them began moving toward the main hangar, a processional of officers and veterans and witnesses to the impossible. Ezekiel moved with them, his feet carrying him forward even as his mind screamed warnings about what was coming. In 30 minutes, he would face his daughters. In 30 minutes, he would see their eyes and know whether forgiveness was possible or whether he had destroyed something that could never be rebuilt. In 30 minutes, the hiding would be over, one way or another. Behind them, standing alone at the edge of the crowd, Lieutenant Westbrook watched the procession move away. His face was blank, emptied of the arrogance that had defined him an hour ago. In its place was something that might have been the beginning of understanding, or might have been simply the shock of a man watching his certainties crumble into dust. The hangar office was small and functional, a space designed for maintenance, scheduling, and flight logs rather than the transformation of broken men. But it served its purpose. Colonel Mitchell had dispatched a sergeant to retrieve a classy uniform from the installation's ceremonial stock, and while the fit would not be perfect, it would be presentable. Ezekiel stood in the center of the room, his torn jacket removed for the first time in years, the layers of his street existence peeled away to reveal the man beneath. His body showed the damage of 6 winters outdoors, the thinness of irregular meals, the weathering of exposure. But beneath the surface, the frame of the pilot remained. The shoulders that had absorbed thousands of hours of rotor vibration. The hands that had guided an aircraft through conditions that should have been fatal. The posture that straightened unconsciously when addressed. Muscle memory that 6 years of vagrancy could not erase. Harrelson stood by the window, watching the ceremony preparations in the distance. The VIP section was filling now, officers in dress uniforms and civilians in formal attire taking their seats. Somewhere in that gathering, Aaliyah and Amara were preparing to receive an award that recognized the pilots they had become in their father's absence. The sergeant returned with the uniform, a set of dress blues that approximated Ezekiel's measurements. Behind him came the young pilot Chun, carrying a small box. "Sir," Chun said, approaching Ezekiel with something between reverence and nervousness. "I hope this is not inappropriate, but when word spread about who you were, some of the pilots at the museum wanted to contribute." He opened the box to reveal a collection of items. Aviator wings, polished to a bright shine. A Night Stalker unit patch. A CW-5 rank insignia. Ezekiel stared at the contents, his throat tightening. "These are not mine." "No, sir," Chin agreed. but they are what you earned. What you are. The museum curator is working on retrieving your original decorations from the archives, but for now, we wanted you to have something. You should not face your daughters without the symbols of what you accomplished. Harrelson turned from the window, his voice gruff with emotion he was trying to control. Put on the uniform, Zeke. Let's make you look like a night stalker again. The process of dressing was mechanical, movements repeated so many times over 23 years that his body performed them without conscious thought. Button the shirt, adjust the collar, align the seams. Each step was a reclamation, a retrieval of identity from the void he had tried to bury it in. When he was finished, Harrelson approached with the aviator wings and pinned them to his chest. The metal was cold through the fabric, a weight that Ezekiel had not felt in years but recognized instantly. The wings of a pilot, the mark of someone who had earned the right to defy gravity. Chin stepped forward with the unit patch and the rank insignia, and one by one they were added to the uniform. Each item was another piece of the man Ezekiel had abandoned, reconstructed from the generosity of strangers who understood what those symbols meant. Finally, Harrelson reached into his own pocket and withdrew something that made Ezekiel's breath catch. A distinguished flying cross, the metal itself worn slightly from handling, the ribbon faded from age. "This is mine," Harrelson said quietly. "I earned it in Panama a long time ago, but I want you to wear it today." He pinned it to Ezekiel's chest before the objection could form. "You earned 3 of these. You should have at least one on your uniform when you see your girls." Ezekiel looked down at the medal, then up at the colonel who had served beside him through some of the darkest moments of his career. "I cannot take this. It is yours. You can give it back after the ceremony," Harrelson replied with a faint smile. "Consider a loan. From one night stalker to another." The door opened, and Colonel Mitchell entered, his expression shifting as he took in the transformation. The vagrant who had stood near the Apache display an hour ago was gone. In his place stood a Chief Warrant Officer 5 of the United States Army, uniformed and decorated, the bearing of a combat aviator visible in every line of his body. "The ceremony starts in 10 minutes, Mitchell said. "Your daughters have taken their seats." He paused, weighing his next words carefully. "I have spoken with the general. He wants to meet you after the ceremony. But more importantly, he has agreed to a small modification to the program." "What kind of modification?" Harrelson asked. Mitchell looked at Ezekiel. "We would like you to present the award to your daughters, if you are willing." The words hit Ezekiel like a hammer. "Present the award. Stand on that stage in front of hundreds of people. Face Aaliyah and Amara, not from a distance, not from the shadows, but directly. Hand them the recognition they had earned and see in their eyes whether they still knew him as their father." "I do not know if I can do that," Ezekiel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You flew into Mogadishu when Black Hawks were falling from the sky," Mitchell replied. "You extracted SEALs from a valley that should have been their grave. You brought a crippled aircraft home on one engine with your co-pilot dead in the seat in front of you." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "This is not harder than any of that, Chief. This is just different." Ezekiel closed his eyes. Behind his lids he saw Tabird's face, young and alive, grinning in the ready room before mission. He saw Lorraine on their wedding day, radiant in white, promising forever. He saw his daughters as children, sitting on his lap in the cockpit of a training helicopter, their eyes wide with wonder as he explained how the rotor blades created lift. He saw all the moments he had thrown away, all the years he had wasted, all the love he had fled from, because receiving it felt like a betrayal of the dead. And then he saw something else. A future, faint and uncertain, but possible. A future where he stopped running. A future where he kept his promise to Tabird. A future where his daughters knew their father had not abandoned them by choice, but had been lost to a grief he did not know how to survive. "Okay," Ezekiel said, opening his eyes. "I will do it." Mitchell nodded once, the gesture carrying approval and respect. "Then let us go. Your daughters are waiting." The ceremony had already begun when Ezekiel reached the staging area behind the main platform. General Harrison stood at the podium, his voice carrying across the seated crowd through speakers that rendered every word crisp and clear. He spoke of tradition and sacrifice, of the legacy passed from one generation of aviators to the next, of the courage required to fly into danger when others would turn back. Ezekiel stood in the shadows of the stage curtain, watching through a gap in the fabric. The VIP section was full, a sea of uniforms and formal attire, faces turned toward the general with the practiced attention of people accustomed to ceremonies. But Ezekiel saw none of them. His eyes had found his daughters immediately, drawn to them by an instinct deeper than thought. Aliyah and Amara sat in the front row, their army dress uniforms immaculate, their aviator wings catching the light. They sat close together, shoulders almost touching, the unconscious proximity of twins who had spent their lives as two halves of a single whole. Aliyah's hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, her face composed and professional. Amara wore the same style, the same expression, but something in the set of her jaw suggested she was working harder to maintain it. They were beautiful. They were accomplished. They were everything Lorraine had dreamed they would become, and everything Ezekiel had missed by running away. Harrelson appeared at his shoulder, speaking quietly. The general is wrapping up his opening remarks. Colonel Mitchell will introduce the award, and then you will be announced as the presenter. Are you ready? Ezekiel did not answer. Ready was not a word that applied to this moment. He had been ready for combat, ready for impossible missions, ready for the likelihood of death on any given night. But nothing had prepared him for the terror of facing the daughters he had abandoned, of seeing in their eyes the damage his absence had caused. On the stage, General Harrison concluded his remarks to polite applause. Colonel Mitchell rose from his seat and approached the podium, adjusting the microphone slightly before beginning to speak. This year's Army Aviation Association Humanitarian Service Award recognizes two remarkable officers whose courage and skill have saved countless lives, Mitchell said. His voice carried the weight of genuine admiration. Captains Aliyah and Amara Okonkwo have flown disaster relief missions into conditions that would have grounded lesser pilots. They have delivered supplies to isolated communities cut off by hurricanes, earthquakes, and floods. They have evacuated the sick and injured from locations that seemed unreachable. And they have done all of this while honoring a legacy of aviation excellence that runs in their blood. Ezekiel watched his daughters' faces as Mitchell spoke. Aliyah maintained her composure, but her eyes glistened slightly. Amara blinked rapidly, fighting the same battle. The legacy I speak of is not abstract, Mitchell continued. Many of you know the story of Thunderhead. The call sign has become legend in Army aviation circles. The pilot who flew into Mogadishu during Gothic Serpent. The pilot who extracted a SEAL team from an impossible position in the Hindu Kush. The pilot who brought a crippled Apache home on one engine after his co-pilot was killed by enemy fire. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. What many of you may not know is that Thunderhead had another identity. He was a father, and his daughters, the officers we honor today, became pilots to follow in his footsteps. Aliyah and Amara exchanged a glance, surprise flickering across their features. Their father was rarely mentioned at official functions. The legend of Thunderhead was discussed in abstract terms, separated from the man who had vanished from their lives. For years, Mitchell said, his voice dropping slightly, the Army aviation community believed that Thunderhead had passed away. His disappearance was interpreted as a final casualty of the wars he fought. But today, on this Veterans Day, I have the extraordinary honor of correcting that assumption. A murmur rippled through the crowd. In the front row, Aliyah's composure cracked slightly. Amara gripped her sister's hand. Ladies and gentlemen, Mitchell continued, it is my privilege to introduce the presenter of this year's Humanitarian Service Award, a pilot whose courage defined a generation of special operations aviation, a father who has traveled a long and difficult road to be here today. Chief Warrant Officer 5 Ezekiel Okonkwo, call sign Thunderhead. The crowd erupted, applause and gasps, and the scraping of chairs as people rose to their feet. But Ezekiel heard none of it. His eyes were locked on his daughters, watching as the words registered, watching as 6 years of searching and hoping and refusing to give up collided with the impossible truth. Aaliyah's hand flew to her mouth. Amara was already rising from her chair, her face a battlefield of emotions. Ezekiel stepped out from behind the curtain and walked onto the stage. The distance was perhaps 20 feet, but each step felt like a mile. He was aware of the crowd in his peripheral vision, aware of the cameras and the phones recording the moment, aware of the general and the colonels watching with expressions that mixed respect with something softer. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the front row. What mattered was his daughters. He reached the podium and stopped, his hands gripping the edges of the wooden frame to keep them from shaking. The microphone waited, expecting words he had not prepared. But words were not what this moment required. Ezekiel looked at Aaliyah and Amara. They looked back at him, tears streaming down their faces, their composure finally and completely broken. "I am sorry," Ezekiel said, his voice amplified across the silent crowd. "I'm sorry I left. I'm sorry I made you search. I am sorry I was not there when you needed me." Amara broke first. She pushed past the chairs and the dignitaries and the carefully maintained order of the ceremony, running toward the stage with her uniform jacket flying open and her face wet with tears. Aaliyah was half a step behind her, both of them converging on the stage steps, climbing toward the father they had spent 6 years trying to find. And then they reached him, and the distance that had separated them for so long finally, impossibly, closed. Amara reached him first, her arms wrapping around him with a force that nearly knocked him backward. A heartbeat later, Aaliyah joined them, and then Ezekiel was holding his daughter for the first time in 6 years, his body shaking with sobs he could not control, his face buried in the space between their shoulders where their warmth merged into something that felt like salvation. "Dad!" Amara's voice was muffled against his chest, the word torn from somewhere deep. "Dad, we looked everywhere. We never stopped looking." "I know." Ezekiel could barely speak through the tears. "I know you did. I am so sorry. I am so sorry." Aaliyah pulled back just enough to look at his face, her hands gripping his shoulders as if she was afraid he might disappear again. "Why did you leave?" Her voice cracked on the question. "We needed you. After Mom died, we needed you, and you just left." The words were a blade, cutting through the fragile peace of the reunion. Ezekiel had known this moment would come, had known that the joy of finding each other would eventually give way to the harder questions, the deeper wounds. He looked at his daughter's face, so like her mother's, so full of pain he had caused. "I cannot look at you," he said, the admission raw and ugly and true. "Every time I saw your faces, I saw her. Every time I walked into that house, I felt her absence like a hole in my chest. I thought if I left, you could grieve without me dragging you down. I thought you would be better off without a father who could not hold himself together." Amara shook her head fiercely. "We were not better off. We were lost. We had already lost Mom, and then we lost you too. I was wrong." Ezekiel's voice broke on the words. "I know that now. I was wrong, and I am sorry, and I do not know how to make it right." The crowd had gone completely silent. Hundreds of people sat frozen in their seats, witnesses to a reunion that had stripped away all pretense of ceremony and protocol. Phones recorded the moment from every angle. Tears flowed freely among soldiers and civilians alike. Even General Harrison stood motionless at the edge of the stage, his face reflecting the raw emotion of what he was watching. "You are here now." Aaliyah's grip on his shoulders tightened. "That is what matters. You are here." Amara wiped her face with the back of her hand, her composure slowly reassembling itself. She looked at her father, really looked at him, taking in the uniform that did not quite fit, the borrowed decorations, the gaunt face beneath the tears. "Where have you been?" she asked quietly. "All this time. Where did you go?" Ezekiel hesitated. The truth was shameful. The truth was sleeping under bridges and eating from shelters and disappearing so completely that even the Army aviation community assumed he was dead. But his daughters deserved the truth, deserved to understand what their search had meant. "Everywhere and nowhere," he said finally. "I stopped using my name, stopped accessing any accounts. I worked day labor when I could find it. slept wherever I could find shelter. I did not want to be found. But why? Amara's voice held confusion rather than accusation. We are your daughters. We loved you. We still love you. Because I did not deserve to be loved. The words came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. I let Tabur die. I could not save your mother. I failed everyone who ever depended on me. I thought the best thing I could do was remove myself from the equation. Stop hurting the people I cared about by disappearing from their lives. Aaliyah made a sound that was half sob and half laugh. Dad, you did not fail anyone. Tabur's death was not your fault. Mom's cancer was not your fault. You are the reason we became pilots. Every instructor who trained us told stories about Thunderhead. Every technique we learned, every instinct we developed, came from the legacy you built. Colonel Harrelson had moved to the edge of the stage, his own face wet with tears he made no attempt to hide. He spoke, his voice carrying across the silent crowd without amplification. Your father saved more lives than anyone will ever count, he said to the twins. The missions he flew, the risks he took, the men who came home because of his skill and courage. He paused, his voice thickening. And the night Tabur died, your father flew 14 miles through hostile territory on one engine, wounded himself to bring those SEALs home. Tabur's last words were telling him to get home to you, to his girls. Ezekiel closed his eyes as Harrelson spoke. The memory of that night was always present, always waiting at the edges of his consciousness. But hearing it spoken aloud, hearing Tabur's final request acknowledged by someone who understood what it meant, shifted something inside him. I broke that promise, he said quietly. For 19 years, I broke it every day. But you are here now. Aaliyah's voice was fierce. You are here, and that means you are keeping it. Finally, General Harrison stepped forward, his presence commanding attention without words. The crowd watched as he approached the small group gathered at the center of the stage. Chief Okonkwo, the general said, his voice formal but warm, on behalf of the United States Army and the aviation community that has never forgotten your service, welcome home. He extended his hand, and Ezekiel released his daughters long enough to take it. The handshake was firm, the general's grip communicating respect and recognition, and something that felt almost like absolution. Your daughters have earned a remarkable honor today, Harrison continued. But I think the greater honor belongs to them simply for never giving up on finding their father. He turned to address the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what service looks like. Not just the missions we fly or the battles we fight, but the bonds we refuse to break, the family we refuse to abandon. The applause began slowly, scattered at first, then building into something thunderous. People rose from their seats. Veterans saluted. Soldiers who had only known the legend of Thunderhead watched as the man himself stood with his daughters, broken and healed in the same moment. And in the front row, a young lieutenant named Westbrook stood with the others, his hand raised in salute, his face carrying the weight of lessons learned too late, but learned nonetheless. 3 months later, Ezekiel stood on the porch of Aaliyah's house and watched the sun sink toward the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, colors that reminded him of evenings long ago when Lorraine would sit beside him and they would count the stars as they appeared. The memory no longer cut like a blade. It ached, the way old wounds ache when the weather changes, but the sharpness had faded into something he could hold without bleeding. The first weeks after the ceremony had been the hardest. His daughters had taken him home that same day, refusing to let him out of their sight, installing him in Aaliyah's guest room with a firmness that brooked no argument. He had resisted at first, the instincts of 6 years screaming at him to run, to disappear before he could cause more damage. But every time the urge rose, one of them was there. A hand on his shoulder, a cup of coffee placed in front of him, a simple presence that said, without words, that he was not going to face this alone. The VA appointments had been overwhelming at first. Years of neglected health required attention that felt like an assault, doctors and specialists cataloging the damage of street life with clinical efficiency. His weight had dropped dangerously low. His lungs showed the effects of too many cold nights. His heart, both the physical organ and the metaphorical one, needed care he had denied himself for too long. But slowly, visit by visit, the damage began to reverse. Proper nutrition restored strength to muscles that had atrophied. Medication addressed issues he had ignored until they nearly killed him. In therapy, the hardest part, began the work of untangling the knots of guilt and grief that had driven him to abandon everything he loved. The therapist was a veteran herself, a former Army nurse who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before transitioning to mental health work. She did not offer easy comfort or empty reassurances. She listened. She challenged. She held space for the ugliness he had carried without flinching. And week by week, she helped him understand that surviving was not a betrayal of the dead, but an honoring of them. Tabird would not want this, she said during one session that had broken him open completely. He spent his last breath telling you to go home to your girls. What do you think he would say if he saw you punishing yourself for 19 years instead? Ezekiel had not been able to answer. The tears had come instead, harder than they had come since the night he walked away from his daughters. But when they passed, something had shifted. The weight remained, but it no longer crushed him. The door behind him opened, and Amara stepped onto the porch, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. She offered one to him and took up position at his side, her shoulder brushing against his arm as they watched the sunset together. "Aaliyah called," she said. "She is picking up dinner on her way home. Thai food. She claims she remembered your order from before." Ezekiel smiled, an expression that still felt unfamiliar on his face after so many years of forgetting how. "Your mother always ordered for me. I never learned the names of anything." Amara laughed softly. "That sounds like Mom." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "We visited her grave last week. Aaliyah and I. We told her you were home." The words settled into Ezekiel's chest, warm and heavy. He had not yet been able to visit Lorraine's grave himself. The thought of standing before that stone, of confronting the physical proof of her absence, still felt like more than he could bear. But he was working toward it, one day at a time, one step at a time. "I will go soon," he said quietly. "When I am ready." Amara nodded without pushing. She had learned, in the months since the reunion, that her father's healing could not be rushed, that some distances took longer to cross than others, that being present was more important than being fixed. "The museum called yesterday," she said. "They finished updating the plaque on your Apache. Tabird's name is there now. Full honors. They want you to come see it." Ezekiel's hand moved to his chest, pressing against the dog tags that still hung beneath his shirt. His own and Tabird's, together after all these years. He had considered giving Tabird's tags to his family, but when he finally met with Tabird's sister, a woman who had become a Marine to understand her brother's sacrifice, she had refused them. "He gave those to you," she had said, her eyes bright with tears. "He wanted you to carry him. Keep carrying him." And so he did, every day. But the weight was different now. Shared. "I would like to see it," Ezekiel said. "The plaque. I would like to see his name where it belongs." The sound of a car pulling into the driveway announced Aaliyah's arrival. Amara squeezed her father's arm and went to help with the food, leaving Ezekiel alone on the porch for a moment longer. He looked up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. Lorraine had taught him their names, patient and laughing as he fumbled through constellations he could never quite remember. He had taught the same names to his daughters, sitting on this same porch when they were small enough to fit on his lap, their eyes wide with wonder at the vastness above them. He had missed so much. Graduations and promotions, and the 1,000 small moments that made up a life. He could never get those years back, but he had this moment, and the moment after, and all the moments still to come. The front door opened again, and Aaliyah emerged, her arms full of takeout bags, her face bright with the simple joy of family gathered for dinner. She looked at her father, standing on the porch, silhouetted against the fading light, and her smile widened. "Coming in, Dad. Food is getting cold." "Dad." The word still hit him like a gift every time they used it. A reminder that he was more than a legend, more than a call sign, more than the sum of his failures. He was a father, imperfect and broken and finally, impossibly home. Ezekiel took one last look at the stars, whispered a promise to Bird and Lorraine, and went inside to have dinner with his daughters. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that it is never too late to come home, to heal, to reconnect with those who love you, please subscribe to our channel. And share in the comments who is the quiet hero in your life who deserves recognition. Sometimes the greatest courage is not flying into combat. It is walking back to the family you thought you had lost. Thank you for watching.